Welcome to Fear and Greed, the week ahead. This is where we take a look at the big events, reports and releases coming up this week that give insight into the economy and a look back at what happened last week too. I'm Sean Aylmer, and every Monday I'm joined for the week ahead by economist Stephen Koukoulas. You'll find him at thekouk.com and on Twitter using the handle thekouk, TheKouk. Stephen, good morning. Are you disappointed the Olympics are over?
Oh, yes, I've had so much fun. They've been a wonderful distraction from all these other COVID-related issues. And I must confess, I've got into sports I didn't really know existed or how they function. Skateboarding, who would have thought it?
Skateboarding. Oh, we're all fans of skateboarding at the moment. That was fantastic, that fella last week where he won the gold.
Yeah, and that canoeing thing. I've often thought, what if your kids came up to you and said, "Oh, Dad, I'd really love to learn to do that canoeing thing." I don't even know where you take them because I don't know where there's a canoeing course that runs down those rapid rivers. But anyway, it's much easier to just do running and swimming, I guess. I watched it and enjoyed it, and the goal that we got there was fabulous.
That's right. It was. So, last week, in between watching the Olympics, pretty big day on the economics front. What do you make of everything that went on with the Reserve Bank last week?
Oh, look, it was all about the Reserve Bank. Last week we saw the board meeting where they held policy steady. They didn't adjust their bond buying or the yield curve control, let alone the official interest rate, of course, but they clearly were still optimistic. And this was borne out later in the week on the Friday when Governor Phil Lowe appeared before the House of Reps Committee on Economics and answered a few questions. And they put out their quarterly statement on monetary policy. So to summarise all of that, I think it's fair to say that they're seeing this lockdown period now as clearly a negative shock to the economy. You know, these lockdowns that are occurring in all over half of Australia now will leave the September quarter GDP with a big negative, something around about -2%, which is a pretty bad result. But as the Reserve Bank is saying, they reckon that the trajectory is really just an air pocket, I suppose, and that when we get the lockdowns ended, when the vaccination rates are at a decent level, probably towards the end of this year or certainly by the first quarter of next year, they are saying that by 2023, unemployment will be down to 4%, that inflation will be back to within their target band, 2.25%, so still the lower part of their band, but within the band for the first time in several years. So they're still upbeat despite the current, I suppose, pain that the economy is going through.
The bank's been, I suppose, a steady hand on the tiller. When people were saying they needed to lift interest rates, they kind of didn't change their line. And then more recently, when they've said that they're going to have to actually pull back from reducing bond buying, they didn't change their line. So far, they've done a pretty good job, I'd say.
I think they've learned a lot from the pandemic in a sense that, in a way, pre-pandemic, they were reluctant to cut. I recall the debate then. They were looking at house prices and things like that. And in a way, they may have taken their eye off the ball a little bit because inflation back then was still very, very low too. But obviously with the pandemic, they were forced to cut to near zero. The QE program was huge. The yield curve control, the term funding facility for the banks were all super stimulatory policies. And that was also, we've got to remember back at the beginning of this year, before the budget that was handed down by Treasurer Frydenberg, there was a change in the strategy from both the RBA and the government towards full employment. They said that, look, we want to let the economy really run along until we get unemployment into the fours, wages growth back above 3% per annum. And they changed tack. And look, other than these latest lockdowns, which of course are important, they were sort of on track. We've got to remember that the unemployment rate fell below 5% last month and the economy was really strong.
Just before we leave last week, the house price is still booming along that property market.
Yes, the CoreLogic numbers came out early last week and confirmed. And I heard Tim Lawless talking about them too, that the market's still very strong. It's across all cities, and while there's a bit of variation from city to city, there are big annual growth rates in the cities, in the regions, that these low interest rates and the fact that we can't spend money travelling overseas means that people are pumping money into housing. It is still very, very strong. The $64 question, I guess, is will these lockdowns just put a bit of a dent in that house price growth? But for the moment, still remarkably buoyant.
Well, that was last week. We'll be back in a moment and get into the week ahead. I'm with economist Stephen Koukoulas, a.k.a. The Kouk. So, Stephen, a bit quieter on the economic front this week.
Yeah, we've only really got the business confidence measures from our friends at NAB, and the Westpac monthly consumer sentiment number comes out, and they'll have been surveying the business and consumer sector while these lockdowns have been in full force. And so, gosh, it'd be no surprise to see both of them taking a bit of a hit. Clearly consumers are are feeling anxious and uncertain, and locking down people is not a good thing. So no surprises there if we get a pretty decent pullback in consumer sentiment. And we've got to recall that last year, at the height of the lockdowns, consumer sentiment fell about 30 percentage points. So it was a big fall. For the NAB Business Confidence Survey, look, not quite as a bigger fall as expected, because businesses are still pretty resilient in amongst this, and the big business sector is probably still doing quite well, and the export sector is still chugging along and all the rest of it. So maybe the business sector will be a bit more resilient, but nonetheless, there are still going to be probably a bit of a dip in the optimism from business.
Now, what we will get this week, which I always find interesting as earnings season sort of kicks off properly this week, is some of the really big companies telling us what's happening on the ground. And Commonwealth Bank reports this week. Now, they're expected to announce some sort of major capital initiative, potentially a huge dividend. But what CommBank, because it is so big and it's got its finger in so many pies around the economy, often what they're talking about, you get a really close-up view on what's happening with lending and defaults and that sort of thing.
Oh, definitely. And in fact, the bank reporting period is really a guide on the economy because, as you said, they are the lenders of the mortgage market. The big banks, I think, dominate about 85, 90% of the mortgage market. So what they're seeing is going to be really important. They also know what we consumers are doing with our debit cards and credit cards and all the rest of it. And they can see what the business sector is doing as well. Is business credit growth picking up? So they're going to be a really interesting barometer for how the economy is going. And as you said, one of the biggest things that is interesting for economists is if there's any uptick in bad and doubtful debts and provisioning for bad loans and the like. And clearly I'm assuming that's not going to be the case. Certainly the last couple of quarters, the banks have wound down those estimates as the economy's done well. So it'll be fascinating to see how our biggest companies are performing.
Yeah, I mean, the other one there is that the big commodity companies that Rio has already reported, but BHP, Fortescue, some of the battery metals companies, some of the gold companies, the oil and gas guys, commodities has really helped us ride the wave recently. But there's just a sense that, with COVID cases in China rising and that maybe it's peaked.
Well, that's the curious thing. Up until now, the figures have been stunning. The prices and volumes have been pretty good. But again, just at the end of last week, it was interesting. We saw the iron ore price coming off quite dramatically, albeit from a stunningly high level. But just about 10 days ago, the iron ore price was around about $220 a tonne. At the end of last week, it had dropped to about 175. So obviously at 175, these companies are still making a truckload of money, but it's down about $45 a tonne. So that super duper profit that we're probably going to be seeing later this week from the big iron ore companies in particular might just be starting to come off the boil.
Enjoy your week, Stephen. Thanks for talking to us this morning.
As always, Sean, thank you.
That was economist Stephen Koukoulas, better known as The Kouk. You can find him at thekouk.com and follow him on Twitter using the handle The Kouk. I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed, the week ahead.